Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat.
Resolves.
Now, before you attack
Does
me,
anyone have an answer?
well played.
Good game.
Hello everyone, I'm Jumbo Commander, and I have an entire primer on altered art cards for you today. We're going to be running through a bunch of my altered art cards, but mostly I'm going to be talking about the different types of cards, how you can get commissions, the pros and cons of getting your cards altered. So I'm really excited to address this topic. Let's jump right in. All right, the first thing I want to do is show you a few altered cards and talk about the quality involved in them. And so the first thing I'm going to do is show you an altered card that at first glance looks pretty cool, but it's not very well executed. And the reason why is because I did this altered card. And sleeved up and just playing it out and sacrificing this strip mine and getting in your graveyard, everything's fine with this. But if you take a closer inspection, you realize that it's just not really well done at all. And so I want to point out some of these details so that you can tell when your really important cards are well done. So one thing that you can notice at first is this text. This strip mine is not very cleanly outlined from the paint. And actually you can see it even better when you go down to the land. See, the paint around it is very clumsy when outlining that text. And you can even see it in the line of the text box right there. You can see how it's kind of a clumsy, not very straight line. That's something that's pretty easy to take care of if you have a lot of attention to detail. And so a lot of really good alterists will make sure that those lines around the text and around the text box are very, very clean. Another thing that I screwed up on is I was very clumsy when applying the paint. You want very thin layers and you don't want a lot of thickness to the card. I'm trying to catch the glare of the light to show you. There you go. So you can see literally where the paint was applied and where the old card exists underneath. And actually, if I run my finger across, I can feel the raised texture of the paint on the edges. And that's not really good. A lot of times you want lots of very thin layers, and you don't want the paint to sort of pile up on the edges of your card. Now let me compare this to a very professionally done card. This Hymn to Tourach, if you look at the text on it, looks gorgeous. Let's see if we can get in for a closer look. Oh yeah. So do you see how beautiful that text is right there on Hymn to Tourach? It's so cleanly done. And then it's harder to see on the text box because the text box is, also beautifully done around here. But one thing that is really good on this is you can see that there's like an overwhelming sort of sheen because they've put a layer on top of it. But honestly, it's very difficult to see where they've painted. You might be able to see a little line along this guy's cloak, but that's it. And there's definitely no feeling as you go to the edges. It's a very nice feel to it. And so this is a beautifully done altar right there. The first type of art I want to talk about is a very simple altar, and it's usually one done by the artists themselves. This is a Dak Faden, and the artist signed it and made Dak into a little bit of a knight. And you can tell it's really simple because we were sitting down at a GP and he was just kind of scribbling with markers. Same thing with this Mana Crypt. You notice it's a beautiful signature, but the art is very simple. Just a lightning bolt on the Mana Crypt. And then this Crater Behemoth is, again, just some Sharpie. He gave him some wings. He hand wrote flying next to haste right there. And so this is just a very sort of simple altar. And I think it's really cool because it's done by the artists and you have the artist signature on there. If I were to do that on a lot of my cards, just kind of do little doodles, that could be fun. But ultimately, I think a lot of the draw is that the artist is interacting with your card. The next type of altar I want to talk about are ones that use digital art and then put that onto magic cards. So both these Aura Shards and Birthing Pod have incredible detail, but that's because they rely on computers. This Birthing Pod, they've taken down the art. You can tell because this Birthing Pod part right there is slightly raised. So they've taken down the other art and then printed directly on top of this card. And you can tell that the detail on this is crazy, and that's because it relies on a digital printer you know, some sort of nice printer to print directly onto this surface. And that's why they have to take the card down, because you can't print directly on a Magic card surface. It just doesn't work very well. But if you prepare the surface, you can print on top of it. And you can kind of see the text of the birthing pod underneath. But that means that this card can be produced relatively inexpensively. You gotta just make sure to take down the card really well, and then a printer does a lot of the work once you've set up the file and done the art digitally. The same thing can be said for this aura shards, but it's a slightly different technique. Instead of this part of the birthing pod being raised, it's actually lowered in this, because this is gonna be a slightly thicker card, because there's a tiny, tiny overlay that you can feel going over it. So there's basically, this is all an extra overlay, and then there's a hole cut out to show aura shards through. And you can kind of see where the overlay doesn't line up exactly right. And you can see it in the bottom here too, that the overlay doesn't quite line up. But someone did take a lot of care, especially in this little thing right there. I mean, it's very easy to feel the difference. I wonder if I can get some light on it. No, there's also a lacquer on top of it, which does minimize it. Overall, I think these look really good, but these are relatively inexpensive. So don't pay for a professional artist's prices for these kinds of things, because ultimately a lot of the art is done digitally and they can just mass produce them. Whereas a lot of the ones that were hand painted take hours of arduous time. So if this is your style, great, but don't let people confuse you into thinking it is what it isn't. Next, I want to show you a progression of cards, and they're cards that change the art, but they don't really change very much else. This is a Sylvan Caryatid, and you can see how the art has changed, but this part is still intact. It's the same version as before, and it kind of flows outside of the frame. It's a very small altar, but definitely gives Sylvan Caryatid some uniqueness. This is a Stoneforge Mystic, and you can see that the character is even more outside of the art than on the Sylvan Caryatid. And then we have sort of something exploding out of the frame, this acidic slime covering up a lot of stuff. But ultimately, one thing that's important when looking at these is that a lot of the most important material, the name of the card, the casting cost, a lot of the abilities, the power and toughness, those are all intact. And that's what we're gonna see in a lot of these situations. Even this birthing pod back here that I talked about before, has a lot of the text if it's really necessary down there. And a lot of altarists, they try and keep the integrity of the card intact, even though they are kind of exploding off of the frames and the boxes. People love the art on Magic cards, but they want it just a little bit more exciting, and so they kind of extend the art and take out some of the areas. The other areas like this framing that usually goes around there. And you can see that there's a little bit of slight extension off on the other sides, this sort of scratch that goes over there. One thing that I want to note about Borderless is that you can have some excellent Borderless cards, but a lot of the times you'll notice that they fade to black at the bottom. And sometimes that's a necessity because there isn't a lot of excitement at the bottom, but it's also easier for the artist to do that. So when an artist doesn't do that, I really, really enjoy that type of art. I find it fascinating and really visually stimulating when they carry the art all the way through to the bottom of the card. Now, it's not bad if they fade to black. This is just something I wanted to point out that you might say, well, why does this card look more compelling? That might be the reason why. Some of the advantages of extending a border of a card is if your borders are particularly bad. Sometimes you can have cards with messed up borders or nicked edges, and just extending it can clean it up. Or you can have a card that actually has gold borders. This Gaea's Cradle is a World Championships Gaea's Cradle, and so it has a gold border, but it's covered up by this art. I think that that's very clever because I don't think I'd want to paint over my expensive Gaea's Cradle, so having this World Championship card turned into something I really enjoy and looks beautiful in my cube. Speaking of borders, you can definitely play around with the borders. This Treasure Cruise doesn't actually change any of the art. It only changes the borders, and it gives it a definitely different feel. They've made it sort of distressed, and they've put this old school sort of circular border on it. Definitely interesting. This Wood Elves, all that it does is take the existing white border that was on it, because it's a non-foil 7th edition, so it has this ugly white border, and it's sort of painted around it, giving it a little bit of a different look. This is one that I've done, and so you can again see a lot of the clumsiness. I wonder if I can show you how thick it is on the edge. Now it's harder to show you how thick it is on the edge, but you're probably seeing a little bit of stuff, how it's sloppy up here on this line and the light doesn't carry through as well. But honestly, this was a little bit of work, unexpertly done, but in a sleeve when you're playing it, it definitely pops a lot more than a white bordered card. And then speaking of borders, you can start going completely borderless. Sometimes that's easy because you can have a promo that's already borderless. So just by doing a little bit of work, you can make it completely borderless with this Electrolyze and also with this Mana Tithe and this Disenchant. Now, one thing I want to caution you about is that these textless cards are confusing sometimes. If you want a cube that everyone understands, some people might not know what Mana Tithe does and get confused when they see a candle costing 1. Hopefully people are familiar with these cards and you can tell them what they are, because I honestly think that they look phenomenal. And this is actually where I get into my next topic, which is all about clarity. You want people to know what your cards are, and so if you have confusing cards in your repertoire, they could be awesome, but it might not actually be good for the game. This Animate Dead is amazing. I love it. I love how there's the frame that exists there. You know what the card is, you know what the mana cost is, but are you going to remember that Animate Dead is an enchantment? Probably. Are you going to remember that Animate Dead gives your creature -1/-0? Maybe not, and that might make it confusing for your opponents. So sometimes there's a push and pull where it comes to style and functionality. I think that this is very stylish, but it might get in the way of functionality, and that might make your friends dislike your cards a little bit more. Speaking of clarity, I think it's important to be clear with your cards. And I love this Force of Will. I think it looks awesome and is really beautifully done, but my friends that draft my cube don't really like it as much as I do because it doesn't feel like a magic card. It doesn't feel like a Force of Will. Back to the Animate Dead, one important thing is where and when you can play these cards. You can play this Animate Dead in EDH all the time because you can always show someone on your phone or explain to your playgroup what an Animate Dead is. But this is probably not going to be allowed in a sanctioned tournament because there's too much information missing on this card. Ultimately, it's up to the discretion of the head judge to find out if your altar is allowed, but I would not be surprised if they were saying no to this Animate Dead. Whereas this Lava Spike, you may notice it has all of the relevant information there. It's missing an E. An E is covered up. That's it. The mana cost is there, the entire text box is there, everything else really exists, and there's not a lot of paint on it, which could let you feel out the card. Sometimes the cards are really clunky. Think of cards that have extra layers on them, or maybe special hollow foils that have a different thickness to it, and so those could create a problem. Whereas this Lava Spike, very little problem. This Animate Dead could be a big problem. So now you might be asking yourself how to get a hold of some of these awesome altered cards. Well, one thing you could do is go to a local Grand Prix and find an artist that's there and have them sign and alter your card. Those are going to be very simple alters. Remember, Grand Prix are busy places and there's usually lines for artists and they don't have a lot of time to mess around with your card. Also, they sometimes charge for altering your card, and if they don't charge for altering your card, you need to tip them. They are artists coming there for your enjoyment and entertainment. Please give them some money because they're awesome for what they do. But you're not going to get a crazy altered card from a magic artist at a Grand Prix. Sometimes you can send them cards, but ultimately magic artists kind of are focusing on magic art. They're not focusing on making crazy altars. Different cards are going to have a different audience, and a lot of magic dealers don't want to deal with that. They want cards that will sell. And if you're not a fan of this art style, or you don't want Gandalf on your card, or you don't even need a patron wizard, well, that's too many things in the way of selling this card. Another thing is that altered cards are never near mint, and that gets in the way as well. So a lot of dealers just won't touch this entire market. It also depends on subject matter too. If you're a fan of Star Wars, you might love this Swords to Plowshares. Or if you're a fan of this art style, you might go crazy for this Tendrils of Agony. But if you're not, you might just much rather have a completely different magic card, and so that removes a lot of the value from this. So if you're getting your cards altered, you should get them altered for yourself, not for any financial gain. Another way to get altered cards is to commission them directly from artists, and that can be incredibly daunting, but also really, really rewarding. Now, these are two cards that I got commissioned from two different artists, and I have them here because they show two different styles. One of them, I just told the artist, I love your stuff, just do something. And that was this Entomb, and they did a phenomenal job. It's one of my favorite cards. And now some artists can handle that. I've done that technique to other artists, and they haven't done as well. And so I think you need to pay close attention to the type of artist that you're interacting with to see if they are comfortable just kind of making something up and putting it together. Sometimes you can be surprised and so pleasantly rewarded that you have something creative from someone that you respect. And other times you're like, well, I don't like this as much. A lot of artists do love and need guidance. So this Survival of the Fittest, I love as well because it touches upon a subject matter. This is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and this is specifically from J.R.R. Tolkien's version, had this art on it, and it's an awesome art. I love the story, I love the art, and I like the tie-in of Survival of the Fittest with this theme. So this is another one of my favorite pieces of altered art. And the artist did an amazing job of capturing another artist's work on a magic card. And that's something that artists are sometimes more comfortable with. They do these really beautiful translations onto new pieces of art. And some artists are amazing at sort of creating something new. And to be honest, it's not just always about asking the artist, because most good artists are going to be flexible and they're going to tell you that they'll do whatever you want, and they're going to be very accommodating. So sometimes you might need to feel them out a little bit, give them some direction, and then let them go crazy. Also with altered art, make sure that you're flexible. It does take people a long time to do altered art, and a lot of times it's very skill intensive. And so remember that these are artists doing your work, and so it can be expensive, and they can make your cards really truly pop and to be beautiful. But also there's a lot of people trying to do this that aren't very good. And that's okay, just you need to know the difference between what is good and what isn't good, but most importantly, what you really like and what you think is just okay. Because a truly quality piece of altered art does cost money, and the people that do it deserve a lot of our respect and our money for their work. So what do you think? Do you like altered arts? Do you dislike them? What types of altered arts do you have? What types do you want to get? Please tell me down below. Tweet your altered cards at me. I'd love to hear from you guys. I want to know what you think about altered cards. That has been my spotlight on altered art cards. Thank you so much for joining me. Most importantly, thank you to all of my patrons. This video would be impossible without them. A lot of this camera equipment and the time it takes to record this is 100% because of my patrons. Thank you so much for your help. If you like this video and want to see more, please consider subscribing, commenting below, or going ahead and visiting my Patreon page. Thanks so much, and I'll see y'all real soon.